What does it mean to be great? It is a question that we ask ourselves quite often in our individualistic society. It's something that we argue about in every conceivable category. What is the greatest TV show of all time? The greatest song ever written? The greatest athlete in a given sport? The greatest game ever made? These questions have provided us with a near unlimited amount of content devoted to finding a definitive answer. A singular entry in a category that we can hold up as the undisputed greatest, giving us a benchmark to measure all remaining things in said category. While I truly believe this is ultimately a subjective endeavor, certain works of art get brought up more often than not as being the best of all time. For video games, many titles get thrown about for consideration of best video game of all time. Go to any message board, Discord server, or Twitter feed and you're bound to find at least one of these debates raging. But there is one title in particular that is mentioned so often that its greatness is, considered by many at this point, a foregone conclusion. It is the subject of so many greatest game of all time lists and so many multi-hour retrospectives that it's difficult to believe any more could be said about it. So here I am, trying to say more about it, making my first ever YouTube video about this game. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time is considered by many to be a masterpiece, a game that is the very definition of the greatest game of all time. Search any popular publications articles about the topic and you'll often find Ocarina near, if not at, the very top of that list. Released in 1998, Ocarina of Time is one of the standout titles on the Nintendo 64 during an era that served as a transitional period for the video game industry. Technology was advancing and studios were rushing to adapt their most popular titles from 2D to 3D. This didn't go well for everyone, and when you go back to play some games from this era, they can be rough to say the least. The pressure was on Nintendo, the dominant market player for nearly a decade. With Sony's PlayStation taking off, Nintendo needed to nail the transition to 3D with its biggest properties. And right out of the gate, they did. Super Mario 64 set the standard for how games should move in 3D, and continues to influence Mario to this day. But after Mario, all eyes turned to Nintendo's other iconic IP. Could they nail Zelda's move to 3D as they had with Mario? Well, you know how the rest of the story is told. Ocarina was released to rave reviews and would go on to be one of the most historically important video games ever released. Ultimately, the Nintendo 64 would be a disappointment for Nintendo for a variety of reasons, but Ocarina and Mario were two of the greatest games of that generation, according to the general gaming audience. Without them, the Nintendo 64 could have faded into deeper obscurity. Which leads to the point of this video. I've played a bit of Ocarina in the past, but I never sat down to experience it from beginning to end. I've always heard secondhand about its greatness, and up until now, I had just accepted this greatness as fact. So many people talk about it as a defining moment in gaming, and who am I to argue with them? I have no definitive proof that the opposite is true. But the more I thought about it, I began to consider the greatness of Ocarina, and about the nature of the greatness debate in general. As time moves on, technology improves, knowledge increases, and things improve from a technical and performance standpoint. Graphics in games become more polished and lifelike, and athletes become more explosive and dominant. Certain things remain timeless, and historical importance to a medium should 100% be considered when discussing older works. But the simple fact is, games are better on a technical level than they were when Ocarina first debuted. Despite the implied greatness of an N64 era title, both Ocarina and Mario still show some of their age. And as stated before, many games from this era are difficult to go back to today. Does age and the passage of time take away from something's perceived greatness? Should nostalgia and our feelings be discounted entirely from the process of evaluating a work's standing? As 2024 began, I decided enough was enough. It was finally time to fill a gigantic hole in my gaming history and see for myself what makes many consider Ocarina of Time the greatest game of them all. Gaming has always been a huge part of my life since I was 3 years old. I have incredibly fond memories of the first game I ever played, Super Mario World, as well as the games that would define my childhood in the 90s. It was a time in my life that was dominated by Mario, Pokemon, and games based on some of my favorite cartoon characters. While I had always been aware of Zelda's existence, it was always a series that had passed me by, intersecting with my life only at certain and very brief points. Before Breath of the Wild, the only Zelda games that I had any memory of playing were the Oracle games for the Game Boy. I did own a Nintendo 64 when Ocarina came out, and I always remember wanting to play it. But at that time, my mind was obsessed with Pokemon, and the N64 bundle I got for Christmas or a birthday contained Pokemon Stadium. It was a game I always had intentions of getting, but I wasn't willing to assign one of my few birthday or Christmas games I got a year to obtain it. My only option was renting, but the singular copy that was owned by my local video store was never on the shelf. Younger me assumed that it was so popular that it was always on rent. The older me knows that it was probably rented one day and simply never returned. So the years passed, and so did the Zelda titles. The Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword, Minish Cap, Spirit Tracks, Phantom Hourglass. Anytime a new Zelda game was coming out, I would hear about it. But I felt like I'd already missed the train, and because of this, I never prioritized any new Zelda game that came out. My interest shifted from RPGs in the 2000s to the shooters all my friends were playing in the 2010s. It wasn't until my late 20s that my gaming views started to shift once again. I began to look back at the long list of marquee titles I had missed while sinking hours into Call of Duty and Halo. The timing couldn't have been better because, as we all know, something happened in 2017 that changed everything. The Nintendo Switch was released on March 3rd, 2017, alongside the latest Zelda title, Breath of the Wild. The promise of the Switch, which was console gaming on the go, captivated me, and finally, as a working adult, I had expendable income to spare. The stars seemed to align, and with all of the buzz around Breath of the Wild, I was determined to be a part of the Zelda conversation this time. While I wasn't able to grab a Switch at launch, thanks to a last-second visit to my local GameStop, I was lucky enough to secure one in May 2017, alongside Mario Kart and Zelda. And like so many, I found it to be a revelation. I spent hours getting lost in the Hyrule of Breath of the Wild. It was so unlike anything I had ever experienced at the time when I was playing multiplayer games and tons of Monster Hunter. These games focus so heavily on checking things off a list, completing objectives to unlock things, and leveling up. Breath of the Wild was a stunning departure from the games I was playing. While it did cause me a bit of anxiety at first, I allowed myself to get lost in the world. I didn't hold myself to any particular missions or quests, but rather went to any and every landmark that my eyes were drawn to. I experienced the story on my time, on my terms, and ultimately I think that's what people appreciated about Breath of the Wild. It allowed you to approach and engage with it as much or as little as you wanted, encouraging you to craft your own emergent experience while you uncover the mysteries and tragedies of Hyrule. So what does this all have to do with my playthrough of Ocarina, you might be asking? For the longest time, the lens through which I have viewed Zelda has been predominantly and solely defined by Breath of the Wild. I've read and watched a lot of the discourse around the game and came to believe that Breath's greatest strengths lay in how it broke the chains of tradition that were established by Ocarina. It was a departure from the familiar Zelda formula that had defined its 3D entries for the better part of a decade. Sure, it still had the bells and whistles of a Zelda, but it was a new direction, a fresh start for the series that I felt had been stuck with the same formula since the late 90s. One of my other biggest influences on how I felt about Ocarina and 3D Zelda as a whole also came from one of my favorite YouTube videos of all time. It was a sequelitis video on Ocarina of Time by famous Game Grump and artist Aaron Eagleraptor Hansen. In that video, Aaron expresses his frustration with Ocarina and 3D Zelda as a whole, blaming Ocarina for leading Zelda into a monotonous era where exploration and adventure took a backseat to a predictable tour that wouldn't sacrifice formula for innovation. Ocarina took a formula that worked perfectly for a 2D game and tried to force it to fit a 3D world without making concessions that you would need to factor in when considering multi-dimensional spaces. You walk into dungeon rooms, and unlike a 2D layout, you aren't getting all the information right away while you fight enemies or overcome obstacles. Of course, future games would adapt to this new way of exploring the world, but the jump didn't appear so smooth right at the start. With my knowledge of Breath of the Wild and influences like sequelitis, I thought I had Ocarina figured out. I appreciated what it did for games, recognizing its importance in the history of the medium, but I tended to think this was overrated, overblown. I venerated Breath of the Wild because it appeared to break these bonds of formula and predictability by offering a truly freeing experience, a world that you were dropped into and told to go with little to no direction. It was in the spirit of the first Zelda, which was the true and purest form of Zelda at its core. Armed with this understanding, I went about my life. But as the years passed and I began creating content, Ocarina crept back into my mind. I had started 2 podcasts and met many online friends who had different and unique ways of thinking about games. I learned a lot from them about how to analyze and think about games, critique them, and began to develop more of my own personal views as I replayed many games I had missed as a kid. Opinions or justifications based on second or third-hand knowledge weren't enough for me anymore. I needed to experience things for myself and form my own opinions. Even though I was primarily creating audio content in the form of a podcast, an idea formed in my mind. With my first child soon to be born, I wanted to make a video. I wanted to finally go back and experience something that had followed me since my childhood. It was time to find out what made Ocarina so great. Knowing my experiences with Breath of the Wild would significantly impact my lens and thoughts about Ocarina, I tried to go in with as open a mind as possible. This was an N64 game. It didn't have to be the cutting-edge open-world game I had come to know and love. To place those burdens upon Ocarina for a first-time playthrough would be unfair. It also should be noted that I played the game on the Nintendo 64 expansion for Nintendo Switch Online. I didn't have money to throw at original hardware or an original copy of the game, and I'm not the most tech-savvy individual when it comes to emulating, so I played with what I had. Nothing will ever replace the original hardware, but this is ultimately the path that I chose. Ocarina opens with ominous tidings. The camera pans over to a young boy sleeping as the Great Deku Tree explains a bit about the world to us. The boy is one of the Kokiri, a race of forest-dwelling beings who will never grow up. You can name him anything you choose, including butt, fart, and all of those classic funny names we surely thought of as children. But for the sake of simplicity, we'll call him Link. All the Kokiri have a fairy companion except for this boy, until the Great Deku Tree sends the fairy Navi to Link with a dire warning. Evil is stirring. Link is fated to be a chosen hero to challenge it, and the Great Deku Tree is running out of time. Upon meeting Navi and being summoned to the tree himself, we spend some time exploring Kokiri Forest, meeting a girl known as Saria, learning the game's movement, and most importantly, acquiring a sword and shield so we can bypass the obnoxious guard barring the way to the Great Deku Tree. It's a great little intro that teaches us the basic mechanics of interacting with a 3D world. Back in 1998, this was likely still an intimidating process, as we were still in the early years of 3D gameplay. The game still had the same conventions as 2D Zelda, i.e. interacting with NPCs, gathering items and rupees, but these events now played out in a space with infinitely more possibilities. Kokiri Forest is a perfect playground similar to the exterior of Peach's castle in Mario 64. It was also a place to learn one of the core mechanics, Z targeting, which was key to interacting with Ocarina's world and to combat in a 3D environment. We reach the Great Deku Tree, and he has a test of courage for us, inviting us inside his innermost recesses to find the evil that has cursed him in order to defeat it. Again, just as Kokiri Forest is a great intro for the general gameplay of a 3D Zelda, so too is the Great Deku Tree a great intro for how traditional Zelda dungeons will play out in a 3D space. We learn many tricks and solutions to simple puzzles here, as well as encounter some of the more tame enemies in the game such as Skulltulas, Deku Scrubs, and a few others. Ultimately, we proceed through the dungeon and defeat Queen Goma, the evil entity responsible for the curse that the Deku Tree suffers from. Upon her defeat, we return to the outside forest, and we are entrusted with the Kokiri's Emerald, one of the spiritual stones. After passing on the stone and warning us of the schemes of the evil man who cursed him, the Great Deku Tree dies, but not before instructing us to head to Hyrule Castle to meet the Princess of Destiny. From here, we're able to enter Hyrule Field, an expansive space that connects all the regions of the game. Although you have your next objective, you also have a little more freedom to wander around and explore this space, which is a huge departure from Kokiri Forest and the Great Deku Tree. Eventually, our wandering will lead us to make progress and enter Hyrule Castletown, a bustling and vibrant community filled with shops and minigames that lie just at the doorstep of the castle proper. After some mischievous sneaking and dodging of the guards, we finally enter the castle, proceed through the gardens, and meet up with none other than Princess Zelda herself, who exposits the main plot of the game. Zelda suspects that a man named Ganondorf is attempting to gather all of the spiritual stones and use them to access the sacred realm. It is there that he can claim the Triforce for himself and use its power to rule the world. To combat this, Zelda comes up with a plan to have Link gather the spiritual stones from each of the races of Hyrule and free them from the curse Ganondorf has laid upon them. She teaches us the royal medley Zelda's Lullaby, which will grant us access to the different areas of Hyrule and sends us off on the next part of our adventure. Our next objectives are clear. We need to obtain the spiritual stones. One is the Goron's Ruby, which we get from the Goron Darunia once we defeat King Dodongo in Dodongo's Cavern so that the Goron's source of food is restored. This takes us to the locations of Death Mountain and Goron City. The other is the Zora's Sapphire, which is acquired when we save the Zora Princess Ruto from inside Jabu Jabu's belly, which all takes place in Zora's domain. This threefold quest for the spiritual stones serves two purposes. First, it takes us around to meet the different races and inhabitants of Hyrule, building out the world while allowing us to make progress in our overall quest. Second, it introduces us to the standard progression sequence the game is known for. You spend some time exploring the overworld, eventually making your way to the objective. You make your way through a dungeon to obtain the spiritual stone, finding new items that help you progress through said dungeon and potentially allow you to access secrets and solve puzzles you may stumble across in the wider world. This is the Zelda formula at its core, the one we've come to know and love. Progress towards the dungeon, proceed through the first half of the dungeon, acquire an item that helps you go through the rest of the dungeon, defeat the boss, and acquire the spiritual stone and a heart container that makes you just a bit stronger. This formula works because it's a great way to not only keep the player moving forward, but also make the player stronger by giving them more hearts and more equipment. Finally, we acquire all the spiritual stones and head for the Temple of Time. Before we do, we're treated to a cutscene with Zelda and Impa fleeing the castle, with Ganondorf in hot pursuit. We see Zelda ditch the titular Ocarina of Time, which we recover. We then use the stones to unlock a sealed door within the temple, revealing the Master Sword, which we pull from its pedestal and find ourselves enveloped in a bright column of light. But our victory is short-lived, for in the white void, we see the visage of Ganondorf, who followed us into the temple and now has full access to the sacred realm because of our actions. When the bright light fades and we see Link again, we're greeted to a world stuck in the clutches of Ganondorf's rule. Not only that, thanks to some exposition from Rauru, the Sage of Light, we discover that we are 7 years in the future. Link has now grown into an adult and emerges into a much different world than he knew as a child. I won't go into too much detail about this specific part of the game. It'll be relevant to a later section of the video. So I'm sure you're wondering, what's the point of me recounting all of this, right? Odds are you've played this or at least know the story beats. Why am I recounting the tale of the first half of Ocarina to you? Well, because in my playthrough of this first part of the game, I think I found some of the answers to the questions I had been asking about the greatness of Ocarina. Once I completed the Great Deku Tree and got into Hyrule Field, I started to treat the game like I would any other adventure or open world game. I had a clear objective and goal, I had to find Princess Zelda, who would then lay out the rest of my objectives for me, telling me where I had to go next. This was the progression system I expected, influenced by what my third-hand knowledge of Ocarina was leading me to believe. So I dutifully went to each objective, checking each story beat off the list. At first, I'll be honest, this didn't particularly excite me. I had played adventure games like this before. I'd experienced open-world games where I would move from icon to icon, completing the tasks the game laid out for me. I remember specifically thinking to myself after completing Dodongo's Cavern, I'm not sure I see what all the fuss is about when it comes to Ocarina of Time. So once I finished off my business with the Gorons, I decided to wander from the Golden Path, to see if there was anything out in the world beyond the guided tour I had been on so far. And this is when everything started to make sense. You see, the reason I adore Breath of the Wild is because of the freedom it allows a player. Once you've completed the Great Plateau, you're pretty much left to your own devices in the expansive world of Hyrule. You're free to go to story beats marked on your map, head straight to Calamity Ganon, or wander towards whatever catches your eye. This is how I played the majority of the game, letting my eyes and feet take me on a journey that was all my own, while allowing me to experience the beauty of Breath's world. It was only when I was ready to wrap up the story of the game that I began to check off shrines and story beats like they were items on a list. This part didn't live up to my earlier expectations where I was allowed to just explore the world organically, and I think this was the point. The Zelda team didn't want you to go from story beat to story beat or shrine to shrine like you were at a grocery store. They wanted you to focus on the journey in between those moments, the beauty of the world, the depths of the experience. It was truly a case of it's not the destination, it's the journey. I'll admit, I thought I had Ocarina figured out as soon as I started it up. I think I let my preconceived notions influence the way I was playing the game. I was expecting a guided tour of Hyrule, so I got a guided tour of Hyrule. But when I broke free from my tour group, that's when something clicked. Armed with a few new items and a better grasp of the world I was in, I decided to poke and prod the world, using bombs to open secret areas, revisit different parts of the world at day and night, and try to slow down and interact with things rather than rushing to check off the next objective on my grocery list. And this changed everything. I was stunned at the depth and complexity of this N64 world. I was discovering gold Skulltulas, little puzzles that rewarded me with rupees, mini games to play, and secret areas to unlock with bombs and heart pieces. I discovered a graveyard with a gravekeeper named Dampe who would dig spots up for me. I discovered hidden areas beneath gravestones, a house with a horrifying Skulltula curse, and things I could do with my ocarina. I visited Lon Lon Ranch and befriended Epona, who would later become a close traveling companion during the adult portion of the game. I couldn't believe the sheer volume of surprises, secrets, side quests, and optional content that were hidden in this game. I'd assumed incorrectly that just because it was an older game, it couldn't emphasize the journey in the same way Breath of the Wild did. I'd played Zelda games after Breath of the Wild and liked most of them, but it wasn't until Ocarina that I figured out what I enjoyed most about Zelda. It wasn't the dungeons or puzzles or items or even the story. Don't get me wrong, all that stuff is great, and Lord knows those things are part of the Zelda formula that has sold millions of games. But to me, I finally knew what I loved and appreciated most about Zelda and what made Ocarina great. It wasn't about the stops on the tour at all. It ultimately was the journey I was on that made me fall in love with what many call the greatest game of all time. Oftentimes, we get caught up in the destination, laser focused on where we're going. I've done it many times in my life. I was too eager to get to where I was headed and didn't appreciate the things that happened along the way. Although Ocarina is more structured than Breath of the Wild, it isn't the rigid Hyrule tour that I expected it to be. It's a world brimming with excitement and adventure, begging you to get lost in the rolling hills and towering mountains. It's a game that wants you to poke and prod, and rewards you for doing so. Sure, you can rush from objective to objective, but this is ultimately a disservice to the game, just as it is in Breath of the Wild. This isn't a checklist of icons to mark off the map, nor is it a race to clear this game off your backlog and move to another. Zelda truly shines when you're able to just lose yourself for a few hours. The journey is truly beautiful, and it rewards you for taking the time to treat it as such. The destination can be excited. It can even be considered great. But there is greatness and excitement in the journey as well. On the surface, everyone knows what a Zelda story consists of. There's an iteration of the hero Link, chosen by destiny to do battle with the forces of evil alongside Princess Zelda. There's a Master Sword, sometimes a Triforce, a kingdom in danger, and a world rich with characters and themes. Ocarina's story and narrative present many themes, but the one that resonated the most with me was that of growing up. I mean, how could it not? Link literally travels 7 years in time where he discovers he's grown up and missed a considerable portion of his childhood. Of course, this theme has been talked about to death from every conceivable angle, but I think it was this theme, more than any others, that caught my attention the most. I was not entirely prepared for how much it would resonate with me in this playthrough. Maybe it did even more so now that I'm about to become a father for the first time. And I've spent a good deal of time these past few months just reflecting on the path that I took that led me to this moment. At the start of Ocarina, Link is a kid in the Kokiri Forest. Other than not having a fairy, he resembles most of the other children that live there. You could imagine him living a pretty carefree life with his peers, playing in the woods, not at all concerned with the goings-on of the outside world. But as soon as we name our character, the Great Deku Tree calls upon us for a greater purpose, and immediately, the burden of being the hero is placed upon Link's young shoulders. From here, Link is thrust into the wider world, tasked with collecting the spiritual stones which would ultimately prevent Ganondorf from accessing the Sacred Realm. The Hyrule of Link's youth is fairly peaceful, townspeople are lively, the sun is shining, and the world is fairly welcoming. Sure, we're saddled with the expectations of a hero, and some things are kind of scary considering you're a kid, such as Skulltulas or Deku Scrubs, but nothing that feels overwhelming. For the most part, these fears and challenges are tucked away in corners of the world, largely removed from view. We're aware of the evil that stirs, but it seems distant, far off. Something that through the eyes of a kid doesn't seem so serious. When Link obtains the Master Sword, everything changes. He finds himself shunted into a future far removed from his time as a kid. All of the distant evils and fears of that time come to pass, and an older Link emerges into a new world that feels much more sinister than that of his childhood. Forced to grow up in an instant, Link must now contend with a world dominated by Ganondorf and affected by his evil. When Link emerges from the Temple of Time, gone is the bright and happy town that surrounds Hyrule Castle. It is now an abandoned ruin, shrouded by darkness and populated by re-deads, zombie-like shuffling corpses with a shrill scream that will freeze you in your tracks. As an adult, Link's role as the hero becomes much more serious. He must visit all the temples of the land that have been infected with Ganondorf's evil and purge them, releasing the power of the sages who will help him defeat Ganondorf and seal him away in the Sacred Realm forever. He must face evils and horrors that are much more terrifying than those of his past, such as phantoms of Ganondorf himself, ghosts, a shadow temple that hides the bloody history of Hyrule's past. You don't have the luxury of the innocence of childhood anymore. As an adult, you must face the harsh truth that this world is much darker and grayer. In a way, this story's theme of growth and growing up had a profound effect on me as I started to look back on my life as a kid and now as an adult who's about to have his first child. In a way, we are all like Link at the start of the story. We sleep our mornings away while not having to worry about the greater happenings of the world around us, blissfully unaware of how many problems the world has. As we start to grow up, we gradually accumulate more and more pressure and responsibility from the world. Just as Link had the enormous burden of being a destined hero thrust on him by the Great Deku Tree, we also become burdened with all the expectations of being a kid growing up. As we progress through age in school, we get more homework, more sports to play or after-school activities to participate in, and more friendships that have their own set of expectations. We place an enormous burden on our kids at such a young age while shielding them from some of the harsher truths of the world. As they begin to approach adulthood in their high school and college years, we expect them to make life-altering decisions. putting pressure on them to determine the course of the rest of their lives without arming them with an understanding of how the world works. And then it happens. Suddenly one day, you blink, you wake up, and you're an adult. You've graduated college or entered the workforce and are expected to just start being a normal functioning member of society. For myself, I came out of college with my confidence at an all-time high. A bright-eyed 22-year-old ready to take on the world and leave his mark. A mere 6 months later, reality started to set in. Resume after resume, interview after interview, I still couldn't find a job. This wasn't the world I was promised, the world I was told about. The actual truth of the world was much grayer, much colder. In a way, during my playthrough of Ocarina, I felt a connection to Link. He experienced what I did. Link emerged from the Temple of Time after claiming the Master Sword as an adult and saw a world that was drastically different than he was used to. Gone were the carefree days of his childhood. He now had to fulfill his role as the hero of time and save Hyrule. And Link lives up to his calling. He emerges from childhood and manages to save the world, living up to the tremendous expectations that were placed on him as a kid. All of us are not so lucky, as I and many of my generation have struggled with this truth. When many of us got to the other side, what was waiting for us was not what was promised. It was a world that, frankly, was much messier than we had realized growing up. Unlike Link, many of us didn't feel we could live up to the expectations that had been placed on us. Now, I know this episode is about Ocarina, but I couldn't help but notice the connection I felt with the game and how it compared to the flow of my own life and the lives of so many friends and people that I knew. Growing up is not easy. Many of us struggle with the loss of innocence and carefree attitudes that we took for granted in our younger years. As we age, the world can feel like that of future Hyrule, a dark and unforgiving place ruled by people who don't have the best intentions. It's something that I think a lot of people in my generation and around my age are currently trying to come to terms with. We still feel like we're kids at heart, but our age tells us otherwise. We wish to return to the carefree days of youth and reclaim the time we now spend working for ourselves. But this just isn't possible. Our new struggle is to find purpose and meaning now that we're older, to define our lives beyond the misery and suffering that is so pervasive in our world. It is the reason we do the things we do, why nostalgia is so powerful for us. It reminds us of a time when we didn't carry the cares we do now. Maybe I'm generalizing, maybe the imminent birth of my son has changed my perspective. I'm not sure. But when I sat down to write this script, I knew I wanted to talk about this specifically. It's the reason I do this in the first place, because I believe games as a storytelling medium connect with our lives and our personal stories in meaningful ways. I've been told by everyone in my entire life that games are a waste of time, and have even been criticized for the amount of time I've devoted to them. In this instance, I feel validated. On the surface, Ocarina is an adventure to defeat evil, but at its core, it is a lesson in the realities of growing up. The flow of time is always cruel. Its speed seems different for each person, but no one can change it. A thing that does not change with time is a memory of younger days. These words are spoken by Sheik, who we know to be Princess Zelda in disguise. This particular line struck me to my core, but summed up my feelings on growing up pretty well as I prepare to welcome a new person into this world. It's sometimes hard to reconcile with the flow of time. It feels like it goes too fast. Moments we want to last forever are gone in an instant. But something does remain, as Sheik says. Memories of younger days. I've been thinking about those memories a lot lately. The days I spent in school, the games I played growing up, the friends I made and lost along the way. There is pain there, suffering, realization that those days are gone for good. But there is also learning and hope. We can take those memories and lessons and pass them on, using them to teach others better and perhaps change the world for the better. Growing up can hurt. It can be one of the most painful experiences you'll ever have. But growth as a person is only possible via the passage of time, and that is a beautiful thing. To quote Sheik once more, time passes, people move. Like a river's flow, it never ends. A childish mind will turn to noble ambition. Young love will become deep affection. The clear water's surface reflects growth. So here we are, approaching the end of this script. I'm not entirely sure I answered the question I set out to answer. As I wrote the script and organized my thoughts on my time with Ocarina, I went in a couple of different directions I didn't expect. But in my narrative wanderings, I think I may have ultimately answered the question, at least for myself. Is Ocarina great? Does it deserve its status as the greatest game of all time, alongside all of the constant praise it gets to this day? Ultimately, greatness is hard to pin down. I think to try and fully define it is nearly impossible. To distill what makes something truly great down to a simple explanation that fits everyone's criteria is the textbook definition of a fool's errand. But the thing about greatness is, we know it when we see it. We know when something is truly exceptional, truly spectacular, because it leaves a lasting impact. While there are too many games that exist for a singular title to ever be considered the greatest, I think greatness ultimately lies in the eye of the beholder, just like every work of art. If you're looking for more of a straight answer, I think the greatness of Ocarina can be seen the clearest in a historical context. What this game did at a time when many developers were struggling with the transition to 3D is nothing short of a miracle, and Nintendo did this twice within 2 years of the launch of their 3D console. When you look back at the Nintendo 64, it's easy to see it as a failure, one of the less stellar moments of Nintendo's existence. But despite that, it boasts a game that is consistently discussed in the GOAT conversation, and not many consoles can say that. Sure, games have come a long way in every sense of the word. Graphically and gameplay-wise, most games that come out today are more refined, superior packages. This is the natural order of things as technology progresses, and as we get better at an art form. But a title's modernity doesn't mean that preceding titles that came before it aren't to be revered and enjoyed. Just because we can do on a computer what the great artists used to do on canvas with oil paint, doesn't mean those works of art have no value. If your view of art and experiencing video games is shaped by this thinking, then I feel like you're missing out on the point. Everyone who plays games is different. The lens through which we view and evaluate things is shaped by our life experiences. Different story beats and gameplay connect with us differently, depending on what we're trying to get out of a game. Some value story and narrative above all else, and others need consistent and engaging gameplay. And yes, to some people, even graphics matter most above all. Personally, I consider Ocarina great. It wasn't the smoothest experience to go back and play today, as I think most N64 games have generally not aged well, especially when you can't play them on original hardware. But it did something that I didn't expect. It challenged my preconceived notions I had about the game and made me reconsider what I thought I knew not only about Ocarina, but Zelda as a whole. And I think now my understanding of the series is better because of it. It had narratives and themes that were able to connect with me on a level that I was not expecting, and gameplay that, while dated, was able to surprise and delight. When it comes to Ocarina, I finally get it. Our experiences shape our lives as we grow. We learn things as we fail, succeed, laugh, cry, love, strive to accomplish goals, and give our lives meaning. I will always love Ocarina for what it is and how it connected with me, especially at this time in my life. It allowed me to think back on the things I had experienced before and ultimately appreciate the person I had become. And that, to me, is the true mark of greatness.